It's September 8th, 1900. For most in the United States, it was just like any other September day. But for those on the upper Texas coastline, it was hell on earth. A powerful, destructive Category 4 hurricane was unleashing its wrath on the coastline. 12 to 15 feet of surge slammed into Galveston Island and the Boulevard Peninsula, with higher amounts in Galveston Bay. The destruction, widespread. The city of Galveston, which was larger than Houston at the time, turned into nothing more than piles of timber and bricks. The death toll, anywhere between 6,000 and 12,000. The 1900 Galveston hurricane became the deadliest tropical cyclone in U.S. history, a record that lasts to this day. The hurricane ended up shaping the history of the Texas coastline, as Houston would soon become the dominant city instead of the booming Galveston. The golden era of Galveston was over in less than 24 hours. In response to the storm, a 10-mile-long, 17-foot-tall seawall was erected on Galveston Island to prevent the tragedy that occurred on September 8, 1900 from happening again. It was tested multiple times. The 1915 Galveston hurricane brought 12 feet of surge to the area. Only 53 died compared to the thousands 15 years prior. Hurricanes Carla in 1961 and Alicia in 1983 also tested the seawall, and the wall proved to be vital in limiting damages to Galveston. Come 2008, the only thing that could wreck the seawall again would be a historically strong storm making landfall on the Texas coastline like the storm in 1900. Or that's what residents thought at the time. Unfortunately for them, it was a Category 2 hurricane over 400 miles wide that gave the upper Texas coastline a reality check. In September 2008, a small tropical wave off the coast of Africa transformed into a monstrous hurricane named Ike, slamming and causing devastation to parts of the greater Antilles. After that, it aimed straight for the Texas coastline, striking the upper coast before causing extensive damage through the inland United States as an extratropical cyclone. Despite being a Category 2 hurricane, that simple Category 2 hurricane would wipe out and cause major devastation to those in its path. Major storm surge ranged from Brazoria County all the way to south-central Louisiana. How did this happen? Well, I'm glad you asked. Today, I will be taking a deep dive into Hurricane Ike, covering the meteorological origins, the forecasts, the preparations, the impacts brought, the aftermath and response, and how the areas impacted are doing today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. Ike's beginnings go back to late August 2008, originating from a well-defined tropical wave that moved off the coast of Africa on the 28th. Soon, an area of low pressure developed along the wave axis early on the 29th, producing intermittent bursts of thunderstorm activity as it moved south of the Cape Verde Islands on the 29th and 30th. However, it was still heavily unorganized and remained that way for a few days until September 1st at 6C, where it was designated as a tropical depression. Just 6 hours later, the system strengthened to a tropical storm and was given the name Ike. During this time, Ike was surrounded by dry air, and was unable to develop organized inner core convection. Forecasts for the system at this point had it moving to the west-northwest, being steered by a subtropical ridge to its north. By the 3rd, visible and microwave imagery indicated that strong convective banding had begun to wrap around the center of Ike by 12Z, and an eye became apparent by 18Z. Around this time, a deep-layer low-pressure system over the northwestern Atlantic weakened the subtropical ridge, allowing Ike to move on a west-northwesterly track. The upper-level winds on the western side of the low were strong enough to somewhat restrict the outflow on the northern side of Ike, but otherwise, environmental conditions were favorable for intensification. Within 24 hours from 6C on September 3rd into the 4th, Ike went from a 65-mile-per-hour tropical storm to a 145-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane. After reaching peak intensity, an upper-level high located northwest of Ike began to strengthen, contributing 25 to 30 knots of northerly wind shear that caused the cloud pattern to be asymmetric, resulting in Ike weakening. Microwave imagery showed that the northern eye wall had been severely eroded, but the small eye stayed intact. A building area of high pressure over the western Atlantic forced Ike to move to the west, then west-southwest by the 6th. Only the 5th time a hurricane has had motion like that based on its location to move that way and then move into the Gulf. It was also during this time that models started to show their biases, a problem that would last for most of the storm's lifespan. Track model guidance had a considerable northward bias at the time, with many models showing a less pronounced west-southwestward motion, and then a subsequent turn to the northwest across the Bahamas towards southern Florida. After the west-southwestward dive, models indicated that Ike would reach the western periphery of the ridge and then turn northwest, which didn't happen. By the 5th, hurricane watches and warnings would begin being issued for portions of the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Bahamas, and soon Cuba, with a tropical storm warning for portions of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Preparations soon began in these areas. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, the British Red Cross began organizing emergency response plans to those on the islands. Close by in the Bahamas, travelers made early departures and cruise ships began to cancel going to the region until the storm left. Evacuation orders soon began in Cuba as well. People boarded up their windows, left their homes, and prepared as much as they could for the storm. Northeasterly shear relaxed over Ike on the 6th while it moved to the west-southwest towards the Turks and Caicos Islands, causing deep convection to redevelop over the northern semicircle and quickly intensify back to a Category 4 hurricane by 18Z on September 6th. Its eye wall slamming into Grand Turk, Salt Cay, South Caicos, and a few other small cays, producing 5 to 7 inches of rainfall in the Turks and Caicos Islands, who were still reeling from Hurricane Hannah. The eye wall's interaction with the small islands was enough for the storm to weaken briefly, before making landfall on Great Inagua Island in the southeastern Bahamas around 9 a.m. Eastern on September 7th, with estimated winds of 125 miles per hour and a pressure near 947 millibars. The storm weakened a little bit more after its landfall before it struck Cuba, but quickly intensifying to a Category 4 hurricane right before landfall. At 8 p.m. Eastern on September 8, 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall near Cabo Lucrecia, Cuba, with estimated winds of 130 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 945 millibars. For the next 2 days, the storm would make its name known across the island nation, producing over a foot of rain in many locations as it slowly weakened. Ike maintained an intensity of around 70 knots as it hugged the southern coastline, before making its second landfall near Punta La Capitina in Pinar del Rio around 10 a.m. Eastern on September 9th, and emerging over the Gulf of Mexico around 6.5 hours later. Now, let's take a pause real quick here because it's at this point where it's obvious that Ike is becoming a threat to the coastal United States, and I will discuss the forecast shenanigans in a moment because those are plentiful. To those with minimal hurricane knowledge, what happened to Cuba seemed like it was, for the long run, the best outcome. The storm weakened as opposed to strengthening over open waters if it, for some reason, managed to stay over water for longer. While yes, Ike at this point is a weaker storm, that's obvious enough, its interaction with Cuba ended up making Ike a much more fearsome storm overall. Okay, let's start with the meteorology. While Ike was traveling over Cuba and hugging its coastline, 2 things happened. 1, the maximum winds went down, and 2, the extent of hurricane force winds decreased as well, which isn't unexpected for a hurricane traversing over land. But other aspects of its structure were much different from those of a typical hurricane that had previously made landfall. Looking at it on Mimic microwave imagery, 2 things are apparent. The eye is clearly visible, and the northern eye wall doesn't look too terrible either. But there are signs that an eye wall replacement cycle could be coming based on the double eye wall structure. When it moved inland over Cuba, this inner eye wall quickly deteriorated. Portions of the storm remained over the waters to the north and south of Cuba, allowing for the outer banding to begin coalescing into a much larger outer eye wall structure. During this time, the tropical storm force wind field expands and gets elongated. As the NHC report puts it, interaction with Cuba caused the inner core to become disrupted, and the wind field expanded as it moved into the Gulf. By the 10th, it's finally over open water with no land in its way. What does it do? Well, as it turns out, the initial inner eye wall from its first landfall over Cuba was still intact at this time, albeit much weaker. Meanwhile, the outer banding had continued to organize into an outer eye wall, and the storm underwent an eye wall replacement cycle. On one hand, the eye wall replacement cycle prevented the storm from undergoing rapid intensification. By 18Z on September 10th, the storm only intensified to 85 knots. While this seems like a good thing, eye wall replacement cycles are notorious for their other effect on storm structure. The storm's wind field exploded in size. The storm's tropical storm wind field and hurricane force wind field soon reached out as far as 240 nautical miles and 100 nautical miles respectively. However, Ike would continue to lack inner core convection and maintained its large wind field. Remember, larger storms have a tendency to have more trouble rapidly intensifying than smaller storms. Okay, so that explains why Ike got so big. Let's talk about the forecast. Before Ike had left Cuba, the storm was forecast to move to the west-northwest and make landfall anywhere from northeastern Mexico to the Texas coastline. However, models were yet again being a problem, as they kept showing a strong area of high pressure developing over the southern US, pushing for a landfall between Corpus Christi and Brownsville. Models for a long time kept the eventual formation of that strong high, which pushed Ike's projected landfall to be south of Galveston. That was until late on the 10th and into the 11th, where the forecasted landfall location shifted drastically, from the central Texas Gulf coastline to near Houston. Why? The area of high pressure was nowhere near strong enough to force mostly westerly motion. Remember, during this time, Ike was still heavily disorganized and was expected to, at some point, become a major hurricane again, which it ultimately never did. Models underestimated how long it would take before Ike would become organized enough to begin intensifying at a more rapid rate. But it was still expected to make landfall as a major hurricane up until a day or so before landfall. By the early morning of the 11th, the NHC forecast was staggering. Storm surge up to 20 feet near and east of where it makes landfall, with rainfall totals anywhere between 5 to 10 inches, with isolated amounts of 15 inches. Those in the tropical storm warning were still expecting a high surge of 6 to 8 feet. The storm surge was the main concern going into Ike, and it was mainly because of its large size. With the forecast known by residents of Texas and Louisiana, residents soon began to prepare. On September 10th, 2008, Texas Governor Rick Perry declared a state of emergency, followed by President George W. Bush signing an emergency declaration the same day. Perry deployed 7,500 troops from the State National Guard, alongside 1,300 buses and 300 ambulances to help evacuate those in low-lying areas to Austin and other cities further inland. The federal government sent generators, water, and food into Texas, alongside water trucks and helicopters from the Coast Guard positioned to do water rescues if necessary. Evacuation orders began around the same time, starting with Brazoria County to the south of Houston, and eventually including Galveston and parts of Houston itself. Evacuation orders were constant throughout the coastlines of Texas and Louisiana. Residents were somewhat hesitant to evacuate, especially after Gustav failed to intensify as fast as it was forecasted to before hitting the Gulf Coast earlier that year. But meteorologists and officials were sounding the alarm. Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff stated, "This is not a storm to gamble with. It's large, it's powerful." This was further emphasized with an NWS bulletin released on the 11th, stating, and I quote here, "Persons not heeding evacuation orders in single-family 1 or 2-story homes may face certain death." The strong language of the memo led to some residents, who were hesitant to evacuate at first, to finally heed the warning and leave. Oil refineries on the Texas coast closed up entirely, and roughly 78% of manned oil platforms in the Gulf were evacuated before Ike made landfall. In the days leading to the disaster, one of the municipalities preparing for the storm was Surfside Beach. Lisa Bailey, one of my patrons, worked for the city government, being a city secretary and building official. She told me what the city did ahead of the storm, alongside residents and her family. Her daughter, Nora, spoke on her behalf.
Being on a barrier island, the weather in general impacts the island consistently. Any tropical system entering the Gulf has the potential for impact, so we're looking at it in early September when it was tracking towards the Gulf. We'd already watched The Path of Dolly, and I think there was another one before Ike as well. But Ike became a serious concern several days before it hit. Preparations in coastal areas are actually year round. Building codes, the Texas General Land Office, or GLOW, and local ordinances are routinely reviewed and updated. Surfside City Council had recently approved a new disaster management plan and submitted it to the state. That streamlined many of the services, particularly debris removal. The state also had scheduled emergency management conference calls for all of the municipalities in the potentially affected areas. They detailed the state's pre-positioning of the assets and asked city by city for our updates and needs. These calls began a couple days prior to impact and increased in frequency right up until the last city official evacuated. We always had at least one city representative, but usually more on each of these calls. Our direct preparations were getting information out to people and securing city property. Public records had a laundry list of preparations throughout the city. We backed up all the departmental data and records. When evacuations began, it was in a process that had been laid out by ordinance, such as RVs first, etc. Many boarded their homes and secured loose items beneath their homes by bringing them up on decks. A lot of Surfside is vacation rental properties, so owners often had contractors who handled it, or they came down from Houston or wherever and handled preparations.
How did you and your family prepare for the storm?
I banished them to San Antonio. Since we didn't have the cloud for information storage, I was backing up everything at City Hall to carry out of the area. My kids were directed to pack a bag of essentials and be ready to go. They'd been through this in Florida, so they weren't particularly worried about anything other than their video game systems. My family left relatively late in the evacuation process, and I went with them. Got to San Antonio and went to work in the business center of a hotel printing out the lists of property owners and renters from our utility records. We needed that info for the police department to control access back onto the island after the storm passed. Then I rented a four-wheel drive vehicle for the city and drove back, skirting the side of the storm. It was a few days before my family returned and moved into a hotel across the bridge from Surfside.
Despite the urgent warnings to leave, some didn't, claiming the storm would be nothing more than some wind and rain. Little did they know how wrong they'd end up being. Throughout the week, Ike slowly traversed over the Gulf, undergoing an eyewall replacement cycle to become an extremely large hurricane. However, inner core convection remained messy and disorganized, preventing rapid intensification. Late on the 10th, the subtropical ridge strengthened, causing Ike to turn back to the west-northwest, and the outer wind maximum started to become the more dominant feature. Come the afternoon of the 12th, impacts were already being felt. 10 to 12 hours remained before Ike would soon make landfall, but water was already beginning to top the Galveston seawall by 4 p.m. Neighborhoods were already flooding, and the worst of the storm was still far away from coming ashore. Late on the 12th, Ike reached the western periphery of the subtropical ridge, and turned northwest towards the upper Texas coastline. Microwave imagery and aircraft recon indicated that a 40 nautical mile diameter eye had formed just a few hours before its landfall, and maximum winds had increased to 110 miles per hour. At 2:10 a.m. Central Daylight Time on September 13th, 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall on the northern end of Galveston Island, Texas, with maximum sustained winds of 110 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 950 millibars. A high-end Category 2 hurricane. But the impacts didn't match that, as the storm surge looked like something from a Category 4 or 5 hurricane due in part to how large Hurricane Ike was. Storm surge values of 3 to 6 feet were observed on the coasts of Alabama, Mississippi, and southeastern Louisiana. Storm surge in south central Louisiana ranged from 5 to 10 feet, increasing to 10 to 13 feet along southwestern Louisiana and extreme upper Texas. Sensors indicated that there were isolated areas in Jefferson County, Texas, and Cameron Parish, Louisiana, where storm surge peaked at 17 feet in that region. The highest storm surge occurred on the Bolivar Peninsula and in parts of Chambers County. While sensors failed from saltwater intrusion and large wave action, storm surge ranged between 15 and 20 feet, and waters 4 feet deep covered all of the peninsula. Storm surge on Galveston Island and the west side of Galveston Bay ranged from 10 to 15 feet, and those in Brazoria County received storm surge ranging from 5 to 10 feet. The remainder of the Texas coastline received storm surge of 2 to 5 feet. Keep in mind, this was all from a Category 2 hurricane. Ike was on shore, but the horrors were far from over. For most tropical cyclones, their inland impacts are nothing to write home about, especially when the storm turns post-tropical. Ike was not like that. Ike weakened soon after making landfall, becoming a tropical storm as it passed by Palestine, Texas, and then a tropical depression once it reached out of the state. When Ike became extratropical, a nearby cold front and a very tight pressure gradient resulted in widespread wind gusts up to hurricane force for many areas in the Ohio River Valley. The worst of the wind damage ended up being in Kentucky, Indiana, and especially Ohio. Those to the west of Ike's center dealt with widespread flooding caused by high rainfall totals. Ike also produced a decent number of tornadoes, a total of 29, 2 in the Florida Keys, 17 in Louisiana, 1 in Texas, and 9 in Arkansas. Ike became extratropical once it interacted with a frontal boundary by 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time on September 14th, racing to the northeast. The storm soon weakened and moved over southern Ontario and Quebec before being absorbed by another area of low pressure near the St. Lawrence River by 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 15th. The storm was gone. However, the damage left behind was still present. For many areas, the damage caused by Hurricane Ike was some of the worst they had seen in decades. The damages from Hurricane Ike started in the Lucayan archipelago. All power was lost in Grand Turk Island, and 80 to 95% of homes were damaged. 25% had major damage or were destroyed. Among the damaged buildings was Carnival Cruise Line's $60 million cruise ship terminal. The hospital on the island was severely damaged, with the pharmacy suffering roof damage and most of the drugs being lost. The local prison and police station were also hit hard. In the Bahamas, the majority of the damage was on Great Inagua Island, where 70 to 80% of homes were damaged and 25% had major damage or were destroyed. The Morton Salt factory on the island was forced to halt operations as Ike had damaged its office and loading docks. A few of the flamingos from the Inagua National Park died, but most of them survived by taking shelter in the park's mangrove trees or flying to other islands. Minor damage was reported in Mayaguana, Acklands, and Crooked Islands. Hispaniola, which had already been hit hard by Tropical Storm Faye and Hurricane Gustav, was left in a treacherous spot, especially in Haiti. 74 deaths were attributed to Ike there, with Ike exacerbating the humanitarian disaster in place, wiping out the food supply, shelter, and transportation networks across the nation. In Cuba, 323,800 homes were damaged, with 43,000 being deemed a total loss. Due to the evacuation of 2.6 million people ahead of the storm, the death toll was low at about 7 due to falling structures and drowning. The banana, coffee, yucca, and corn crops sustained serious damage, and about 4,000 metric tons of foodstuffs were lost due to damage to storage facilities. Roadways were washed out or severely damaged across the country, including the 24-kilometer causeway linking mainland Cuba with the Jardines del Rey archipelago, the Granma Highway, and the El Avispero Bridge. Damages in Cuba stand at $7.3 billion, becoming the second costliest hurricane in the country's history. The coastlines of Alabama, Mississippi, and southeastern Louisiana suffered from pretty significant beach erosion. USGS put out a photo comparing the beach erosion of Dolphin Island before Ike and Gustav and after. Damage really started to increase in intensity in south central and southwestern Louisiana. Marshland flooding was excessive along the coast, especially in Cameron and Vermilion parishes. Buildings along a channel connected to the Mermentau River and Creole were hit hard. Homes in Holly Beach, if they weren't damaged by Hurricane Rita in 2005, they were damaged by Ike. Out of all of the areas hit in Louisiana, the worst of the surge flooding seemed to be in places such as Del Cambre, Erath, and Lake Charles, among many others, where the storm surge managed to rush nearly 30 miles inland thanks in part to the low-lying swampland terrain. Neighborhoods were flooded with water, and downtown areas and places in southwestern Louisiana were turned into lakes. Highways and roads were covered with water or barely above it. Areas such as Weeks Island, Cyprement Point, and Petoutville were hit especially hard. Bridges were washed out, making communities inaccessible by car. Homes and properties near the coast were inundated with water, with very few properties staying dry. Spokespeople for the Louisiana National Guard couldn't believe their eyes. They couldn't see the sides of the road, and residents such as Levi Thomas swore that he wouldn't stay behind for another storm again. The damage in southwestern Louisiana was extensive due to the high storm surge, and yet, they were nearly 100 miles away from where the storm made landfall. The upper Texas coastline, within the span of 24 hours, was changed forever. A level of extreme damage that hadn't been seen in the state in decades. The extensive damage started near Sabine Pass, just south of Port Arthur. Homes took heavy water damage, roadways were flooded, mobile homes were pushed inland, and floodwaters were present everywhere you looked. It wasn't uncommon to see debris floating on flooded streets and neighborhoods across town. The worst of the damage was on the Boulevard Peninsula, considered ground zero for Hurricane Ike. While the damage in High Island, Texas, compared to other communities along the Boulevard Peninsula wasn't as extreme, this was thanks in part to High Island being at a higher elevation than the rest of the peninsula. The salt dome on the southwestern side of town was submerged underwater, and oil had covered the waters nearby off of Oilfield Road. Then there was Gilchrist. Absolutely obliterated. On the shoreline, what was once a field of beach houses, gone. Only the pilings remained to remind people of what was once there. Debris from those houses was widespread too. In total, every house except for one perished to the storm surge. That one yellow house belonged to Warren and Pam Adams, who just moved into that house in April, just 5 months prior to Ike. The house was supported by pilings 14 feet off the ground, while other homes either had no pilings or pilings that just went up just a few feet. Water still managed to get into the house and caused a significant amount of damage. Further south was Crystal Beach. From the sky, all you could see was absolute devastation. The discoloration of the ground and lack of structures make it brutally apparent as to what it was like going through the storm. Some homes in Crystal Beach survived, but the once full beach of homes was now empty. In one neighborhood closer to downtown, homes were washed away entirely, with some homes still standing despite the odds. But in general, the entire peninsula was hit hard. Boats that were on the shore were picked up by the water and thrown inland. Low-lying areas on the coast were still inundated with water 4 days after the storm moved through, and within those flooded locations were massive fields of debris from destroyed homes. Neighborhood after neighborhood in the area, even if they weren't on the coast directly, suffered from extensive damage. No matter where you looked, the beach paradise that was once on Boulevard Peninsula was shattered by Hurricane Ike. Most of the attention was on Galveston Island, and the city of Galveston itself. The city, whose seawall had protected them through many storms, such as Hurricanes Audrey and Alicia, was sadly no match for Hurricane Ike. Come a day after the storm, most of the island was underwater. Houses were on fire, and yet, the damage became so much more obvious once the waters had receded. Waterfront homes across Galveston Island were in one of two camps. They were either still standing, with the majority of the damage done being on the inside of the homes with debris littering the lawns, or they were severely damaged, pushed off of their foundations, and destroyed outright in the worst-case scenario. Seawall Boulevard, heavily damaged. Piles of debris littered the side of the road. In other places along the shore, roadways were covered with sand and debris. Downtown Galveston was similarly in a rough spot. While the worst of the damage wasn't there, debris was still littering the streets, and floodwaters and buildings had to be pumped out. Landmark locations and businesses were also swept away by the floodwaters, such as the Balinese Room, a former mafia-run nightclub on a pier into the Gulf. Gone. The flagship hotel, which was thought to be salvageable, was seriously damaged beyond repair. Other landmark locations, such as the Railroad Museum and Lone Star Flight Museum, were heavily damaged as well. For those who stayed behind in Galveston, the common story amongst them was how much worse the aftermath was than the actual storm, such as the case for Brenda Chenette. The lack of power, communications, water, and food was enough for people to say that they would never take a storm lightly ever again. Damage on the western third of Galveston Island, including the communities of Bayou Vista and Jamaica Beach, was extensive. Boats were thrown inland, and homes were thrown off of their foundations. Going into the Galveston Bay, the surge was still high enough for homes to be damaged beyond repair. As for Houston itself, it thankfully was spared from the worst of the damage. Low-lying areas in the city flooded due in part to the high rainfall totals from Ike, and the high winds were enough to topple trees and blow out windows across major landmarks in the city, including at the Morgan Chase Tower. The biggest problem was that the city faced the potential of being without power and little water for weeks. Hagain was 9 when the storm hit, and her family went to a local church for shelter during the hurricane. The winds were strong enough to open the doors in the auditorium, letting the rain come in and causing water damage. Power was out for days, and while their house was fine, others were not as fortunate, with trees and poles falling on roads and homes. Damage further south in Brazoria County was not as extensive as in parts of the Bolivar Peninsula thanks to lower storm surge totals. But multiple areas suffered from pretty high surge, mainly those in Surfside Beach and Freeport, where mobile homes were pushed away from where they once stood. Beachside homes were pushed off of their pilings and roads were covered with sand or washed out entirely. The mayor of Surfside Beach, Larry Davidson, told the Houston Chronicles that everybody was on their own as the surge had cut off parts of town. Lisa Bailey told me what she witnessed firsthand when she got back into town.
Thankfully, there was no loss of life. I don't recall all the numbers, but it was substantial. I don't think there was a single structure that didn't have some level of damage. Several homes and municipal structures were completely destroyed. It goes without saying there were no utilities at all. The storm surge pushed enormous amounts of debris everywhere. Roads were flooded, and as the waters receded, you could see the roads were lifted and destroyed. One of the 2 ways just to get onto the island was impassable for quite a while. The pedestrian beach, which had just been renourished, was gone. The revetment, which is a large stone block wall that had recently been placed, had well in most areas and did as was intended, but pushed onto and over the road in some areas and had to be repaired. It would have been much worse had it not been there. If anyone ever doubts the force of storm surge, they should see how far water can push some 1-ton granite blocks. My memories of what I saw that first day seemed to center on trying to pick my way alone down Beach Drive doing an initial assessment of the damage, and if the properties were safe to enter or not. It was a bright, sunny, calm day, and if it weren't for the news helicopters, it would have been perfectly quiet. Along with the debris everywhere, it smelled awful. Dead fish, birds, a dog, sewage. There was a pelican with a broken wing hopping along after me. They're mean on a good day, a hurt one probably really mad. Snakes, some alive, but don't ask me how.
Another resident, Holly, was 16. Her house survived, but the water line went halfway up the walls. Snakes moved in and all the furniture was destroyed. It took weeks to clean up. Her neighbors were not as lucky, as houses on either side of theirs had collapsed. The historic nature of Ike only continued as it moved inland as well. Damages across the Ohio River Valley were excessive, with states such as Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio having their worst power outages in decades. The worst of the wind damage ended up being in Ohio, where 2.6 million power outages were caused by Ike. My friend Elliot lived in Columbus at the time, and was about to start the first grade. He remembered always reading the weather map in the local newspaper, and distinctly remembered reading it in the newspaper the day after Ike hit Texas. That same day, Ike's extratropical remnants struck as a ferocious windstorm. There wasn't any rain, just the strongest winds he had seen at that point in his life. His family lost power for a couple of days, and he didn't have school that week. The only other time he had seen winds as strong as he did during Ike was during the 2012 Ring of Fire derecho. His experience with Ike ended up being a primary reason as to why he studies hurricanes to this day. Other areas on the eastern side of Ike, such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New York, and parts of Canada, suffered extensively from power outages as well. Meanwhile, states such as Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana suffered from widespread flooding, as excessive rainfall totals caused flooding in the DuPage, Des Plaines, and Chicago rivers in Illinois, the Little Calumet River in Indiana, and the Missouri River in Missouri. By the end of Hurricane Ike's tenure, the storm had killed at least 196 people, and injured hundreds if not thousands. Of the deaths, 74 were in Haiti, 2 in the Dominican Republic, 7 in Cuba, and 113 in the United States, with 16 missing and presumed dead. Damages from Ike stand at $38 billion, with roughly $30 billion in damages coming from the US. Ike became the second costliest hurricane to hit the United States at that time, only behind Hurricane Katrina. It is now the 10th costliest in US history, and the 9th costliest in the Atlantic Basin, with Hurricanes Milton and Sandy being below and above Ike respectively. With the damage left behind, governmental agencies and charities across the areas impacted soon came in to help alleviate the pain. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, following Hurricane Ike, the islands of Grand Turk and South Caicos were declared as disaster areas. The HMS Iron Duke supported the response and relief efforts, and a UN disaster assessment and coordination team went to the island to support recovery efforts. Members of the Red Cross were sent to assist as well. In the Bahamas, USAID provided aerial recon and a disaster specialist to assist the Bahamas National Emergency Management Agency, or NEMA, in damage and needs assessments. And the International Federation Red Cross Red Societies deployed a 3-member regional intervention team to the nation. Cuba organized volunteer brigades to help clear up streets and towns. Others went to try and salvage crops. The UN declared that they would provide financial aid to the island nation, alongside the nations of Vietnam, East Timor, Trinidad and Tobago, Ecuador, Tanzania, and Namibia. The US also offered aid, but it ended up being rejected. In the United States, states of emergencies were declared in Texas, Louisiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Ohio due to the extensive damage from the storms. And a major disaster declaration was issued for Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. In Texas, one of the largest search and rescue operations in state history soon unfolded, with members of the Coast Guard and National Guard being sent out to search for survivors. Curfews were quickly put in place across cities on the coast. Local residents on the coast started to go through the rubble and try and find their belongings, although that was delayed in the worst-hit areas on the Texas coastline until about 10 days after the storm due to safety concerns. But it was mainly the local communities and charities that helped out the most during the recovery effort. According to Rebel Team Gaming, the Red Cross prepped hot meals in the parking lot of Central Mall in Port Arthur for those who had come back in the immediate aftermath. Businesses such as Weather Underground set up donation drives, and Direct Relief provided over $1.1 million in emergency aid. Lisa told me what the city, county, state, and federal governments did following the disaster.
The city government hit the ground running. Our police department, volunteer fire department, EMS, public works, and city officials were all busting ass clearing safety hazards like propane tanks and pushing large debris off main roadways so we could get the island opened up back to residents. We also took the city's main webpage down and just uploaded information and pictures of properties that one of our VFD members took. The next governmental layer is the county, and the city worked with them as well as the state and the federal agencies. Different forms of aid or assistance came from different agencies, all with their own sets of rules. It would take a week-long seminar to lay out just a summary of what all the levels of government did. I'll surely miss some and forget who did what. As a city, we worked with them all. It made sense that because of the enormous destruction across the region, that most of the pre-positioned assets would go where the population was greater and damage more severe. We did receive large building generators and water. As a small community, we knew where our vulnerable people were, knew of circumstances, and tried to directly reach out to assist them. We also received a lot of donations and assistance from people both within the state and across the country. Police departments, fire departments, business owners, churches, and private individuals sending trailer loads of bug sprays, socks, Sharpies, you name it. We had a local man who stepped up to coordinate all of the donations and volunteers who came from all over the country. The Salvation Army was there, and I think maybe the Red Cross too.
However, the majority of articles and sources on the relief effort for Ike was about what wasn't done. In Ohio, the issue was the rate of power being restored being too slow for some residents. But in Texas, it was FEMA. In the weeks following Hurricane Ike, many residents on the Texas Gulf Coast signed up for FEMA loans and temporary housing, only for less than 200 trailers to be available for people to live in while their properties were being repaired. FEMA officials had promised 300 trailers a week. The work with FEMA ended up being so slow for the state of Texas that Governor Rick Perry ordered the formation of a state commission to help with disaster relief. The Governor's Commission for Disaster Recovery and Relief. The commission would oversee rebuilding and develop recommendations for responding to future storms. They also asked for FEMA to cover the entirety of debris removal. Holly was one of those who says she was treated poorly by FEMA, saying she wasn't given any assistance, standing in lines for hours only to be turned away several times. The experience with FEMA led to several grassroots recovery nonprofits to form. The troubles with FEMA were not equal, though. Lisa had a different experience working with the agency directly.
My involvement with FEMA on the municipal level was positive. Yes, the paperwork is a lot, but they also provided inspectors that did detailed reports on roads and municipal buildings. Municipalities also carried insurance the same way as homeowners, so add the insurance companies in with the mix of federal and state entities. The slowest was often the state, not the county, they were great. But as far as I saw that year, FEMA in our particular area was helpful. I'm sure there were people who had very different experiences on the individual level. As for the speed of FEMA timeliness after Ike, I can't recall when exactly FEMA and their people started arriving. We weren't exactly waiting on them, we just got to work. When they arrived, they all seemed professional and got to work with their business, and we met with them as needed. While sitting in eastern North Carolina in 2024, watching TV coverage of the devastation in western North Carolina from Hurricane Helene and the lack of FEMA initial response, I wonder if it's even the same agency.
Regardless of the damage and the long journey ahead of them, many decided to stay put and rebuild. Which begs the question, how are the hardest hit areas doing today? In September of 2008, Hurricane Ike, a long-lived tropical cyclone that originated off of the coast of Africa, made its name known in the history books. Peaking as a 145-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane in the open Atlantic, the storm made its fury well known in the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos Islands, Hispaniola, and Cuba, striking the islands as a major hurricane before hugging the coast of Cuba and weakening to a Category 1 hurricane. In Cuba, the storm was referred to as one of the worst storms in decades, and is the second costliest storm to ever hit the country, only behind Hurricane Irma of 2017. However, that interaction with Cuba, while making it more difficult for the storm to intensify, was the worst best thing that could have happened to it. Ike soon underwent an eyewall replacement cycle, and became one of the largest hurricanes to ever make its way into the Gulf. Its target, the states of Texas and Louisiana. The upper coastline of Texas had been very lucky with multiple different storms that came by. This time was different. Hurricane Ike slammed ashore on Galveston Island with maximum sustained winds of 110 miles per hour and a pressure of 950 millibars. The damage it inflicted looked more like that of what you would see from a Category 4 or 5 hurricane. The Bolivar Peninsula, utterly devastated, and Galveston Island's seawall ended up being no match to the 60 to 20 feet of surge. It was the worst hurricane to hit the region since the 1900 Galveston hurricane. The damage in Louisiana, for areas that were already hit hard by Hurricane Rita in 2005, was made worse, with the surge smashing nearly 30 miles inland through the swampy terrain. However, Ike wasn't done. As it turned post-tropical, its interactions with the frontal system and a tight pressure gradient led to hurricane-force wind gusts across the lower Mississippi Valley and the Ohio River Valley, causing millions of people to lose power in states such as Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, and especially Ohio. The storm holds the record still as the costliest natural disaster to ever hit the state of Ohio. The storm also caused additional flooding in states such as Missouri and Illinois. And even past the US, it still caused significant wind damage in parts of Canada. In total, Hurricane Ike caused $38 billion in damages, becoming the second costliest hurricane in the Atlantic Basin at the time, only behind Hurricane Katrina. Today, it is the 9th costliest. The storm was responsible for thousands of injuries, and the deaths of at least 196 people, with 16 missing and presumed dead. Due to the destruction and lives lost across the Louisiana archipelago, Hispaniola, Cuba, and the United States, the name Ike was retired and replaced with the name Isaias for use in the 2014, 2020, and soon the 2026 Atlantic hurricane seasons. So nearly 2 decades later, how are the hardest hit areas doing today? As for the Louisiana archipelago, Hispaniola, and Cuba, hurricanes are just a part of life there, but multiple storms made recovery difficult. For Cuba, just 2 months after Ike was Hurricane Paloma, which struck the island as a Category 2 hurricane and proceeded to stall out over the island nation. There have been other tropical cyclones since then in the general area, such as Hurricane Thomas in 2010, Irene in 2011, Sandy in 2012, Tropical Storm Erica and Hurricane Joaquin in 2015, Ian in 2022, and Melissa in 2025. But there are 2 I want to mention specifically. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew became the strongest storm to make direct landfall in Haiti since Hurricane Cleo. The nation, which had been struggling ever since the 2008 hurricane season and the 2010 earthquake, was devastated once again. The storm went on to cause problems in Cuba, the Bahamas, and Turks and Caicos Islands. Then, just 1 year later, there was Hurricane Irma. The areas that were hit the hardest by Ike in 2008 in this region, with the exception of Haiti, were hit worse by Irma. For Cuba, it's one of their worst storms in recorded history, with Irma doing $13.2 billion in damages. For these areas, they have rebuilt and moved on since Ike, or had to deal with other storms since then. South Central and southwestern Louisiana has had a hard time recovering. The population growth in the Lake Charles metro has increased, but that isn't reflected in the southernmost parishes such as Cameron Parish, whose population decreased from nearly 10,000 in 2000 to 5,600 in 2020. However, the coastal communities have had it rough, and there's one main reason as to why. In August of 2020, Hurricane Laura made landfall in Cameron Parish, Louisiana as a powerful Category 4 hurricane, with winds of 150 miles per hour. Laura ended up being the worst storm to hit southwestern Louisiana since Hurricane Rita, obliterating communities in Cameron and Calcasieu parishes, among others nearby. Laura's impact on the region has made it difficult for residents to return, if they didn't already move after both Rita and Ike. As for the Texas Upper Coast, well, let's start out with the Bolivar Peninsula. Population-wise, they have not been able to bounce back fully. The population dropped by 37.3% in 2010 in comparison to 2000. And while it did go up by 14.6% as of the 2020 census, the net population difference is a loss of about 1,000 residents. What ended up happening following the disaster is that people left, investors came in and bought land for cheap, and turned affordable housing into vacation homes or sold it later for a higher price. According to residents, though, despite the change in landscape and people, the attitude of those who live in the area hasn't. Galveston's population decreased by about 9,500 residents between 2000 and 2010, and has shot back up to 53,500 as of 2020. The town rebuilt, and the population increase is proof of it. However, that wasn't without issues. As of 2018, less than half of the public housing in the city had been replaced. The population in Surfside Beach went down to 482 in 2010, but is now at 640. According to Lisa, the city had done a good job recovering from the storm before she left in 2014.
It did quite well. Every storm has brought new areas that can be improved to light, and I'm sure since there have been other tropical events since then, those newer building or disaster management regulations continue to be updated and implemented.
Generally, the rebuilding process across the Texas coastline has been slow, but progress is being made. The most notable project to come out of Hurricane Ike is the proposed Ike Dike, a massive seawall that would span the upper Texas coastline from Freeport to the Louisiana border. As of 2026, Congress has just recently begun allocating funds to it after the project was approved by the House and Senate back in 2022. As for storms, there weren't any notable ones up until 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, which I already made a video on. In 2019, there was Imelda, which caused catastrophic flooding in southeastern Texas. In 2020, there was Hurricane Hannah, and then Tropical Storm Beta. In 2021, there was Hurricane Nicholas, which made landfall on the eastern part of the Matagorda Peninsula as a low-wind Category 1 hurricane, and Tropical Storm Harold in 2023. The next big storm was Hurricane Beryl in 2024, which made landfall near Matagorda, Texas as a Category 1 hurricane with winds of 90 miles per hour. Storm surge of 5 to 7 feet struck the coastline, with the worst of the damage being in Surfside Beach, but nowhere near the level of devastation that Ike caused. The main problem after Beryl was the power outages in the Houston metro. Nearly 20 years after Hurricane Ike, the damage done is still visible for many areas in Texas. The proof comes from the trees and homes that are no longer there. Hurricane Ike was a storm that nobody could forget. From the islands of the Greater Antilles to the US mainland and Canada, to many, it's a source of trauma that nobody can get over. From the high storm surge to the high winds and rainfall totals, to those in Ike's path, it's a storm that can never be forgotten, as evident by how the areas that were hit the hardest are doing now. As we approach 18 years since Ike in September, it's a storm that I will not forget anytime soon. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Elliot, Foxtrot, Gamma Ray, and Griff, Elliot, Hagain, Holly, and Rebel Team Gaming for providing their testimony on the YouTube post I made, Lisa Bailey for agreeing to an interview and providing her insight on how Surfside Beach responded to the storm, and her daughter Nora for helping get the interview to happen in the first place, alongside getting me to make this video in the first place by suggesting I cover Ike. Xavier for the hurricane icons I used, and Black Belt for making the animation of Hurricane Ike. And of course, special thanks to my channel artists Celtic White, and Barry for creating the VTuber model I use in my videos, Zinel, Crackleck, and Cyanide Blue for letting me use their music whenever I use it, and everyone for watching, it means a lot. I have a few special announcements to make. I will be returning to ZenkaiCon in Lancaster, Pennsylvania from March 20th through the 22nd. I will also be presenting panels this year, so keep an eye out on the schedule whenever that comes out. I am also announcing that my next video will be on the March 14th, 2025 tornado outbreak, or the 2025 Pi Day outbreak as I call it. If you have footage from the event, or from the aftermath that you would like me to use in my video, you can send it to me on my socials or my business email, all of which are listed on screen right now. Special thanks to those subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member, those being Montpelier, Phoenix, and Queen Hyena at the Alfie's Army tier, Alto Stratamus, Michelle, Tanner, Techno Idioto, and Worm Off the String at the Alf Jr. tier, Bipolar Batty, Brian Holly, Dante DMC, David R, Esri, Foscrew, Foxtrot, Fry JC, James Sullivan, Hannah Stormer, Kara Kelly, King Shisa, Liz Swaff, Means Beans Machines, Rama, Tirani Rialta, and Van Granny at the Ulf Mini tier, and everyone listed at the Ulf Supporter tier. It means a lot. If you wish to support the channel financially, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member to get access to B-roll footage that I've recorded, full interviews, and hopefully Patreon and YouTube member exclusive documentary seminar-style videos in the future. Anyways, that's all I've got. If you liked the video, consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, commenting your thoughts, sharing it around, all that jazz. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Twitch, and even joining my Discord server. All of those are linked in the description. That being said, I'm Alferia, you all stay safe, and I'll see you all soon.